Hey everybody, welcome to chapter 29, Human Development and Aging. This chapter is going to deal with more of the human development part than it does the aging part. So let's get started. Okay, so embryology, which is the study of prenatal development in the womb. Okay, and developmental biology is going to examine changes in the form and function from a fertilized egg all the way through birth and old age and eventually death. Okay, an embryo, the term embryo has varied meanings depending on the textbook that you're reading. Okay, some textbooks or doctors believe that a fertilized egg, or when it's in the two-cell stage, when it's fertilized, when ova and sperm fertilize each other, that is what you call an embryo. Other textbooks and authorities, including this textbook as one of them, assert that an individual becomes an embryo when it's in the 16-day old range, and it consists of these three germ layers: the endoderm, the mesoderm, and the ectoderm. Okay, those germ layers are what eventually becomes your different organ systems. Okay, the term embryogenesis are the events that lead up to that stage of those germ layers being produced, and the pre-embryonic stage is the 16 days, the first 16 days after that fertilization. Right, so it's the 15 days that lead up to this germ layer formation. Okay, an egg must be fertilized within 12 to 24 hours of ovulation if it's going to survive. If it's not fertilized within that time period, it's typically expelled from the female reproductive system in a menstruation. Okay, sperm must encounter the egg somewhere in the distal third of the uterine tube, okay, or the fallopian tube. Okay, that's where fertilization occurs. It does not occur in the uterus. Okay, many people think that. Okay, but the sperm fertilizes the egg in the uterine tube or the fallopian tube. The vast majority of sperm do not make it to the egg. Okay, they never even get to the egg. The reason for that is they are destroyed by the pH of the vagina. The vagina has a very low pH. They could also drain out of the vagina. Okay, so a good portion of the sperm that are introduced to the female reproductive system do not ever make it to the actual egg. Some fail to penetrate the mucus of the cervical canal. Okay, the cervix has thick mucous membranes, and a lot of them fail to penetrate that mucus. Okay, they could be destroyed by white blood cells or leukocytes that are in the uterus. Okay, there are two fallopian tubes, and only one of those fallopian tubes is going to have an egg in it, and half of the sperm go up the wrong tube, right? You have a tube that goes to one ovary, you have another tube on the other side that goes to the other ovary, and those sperm have to make a choice to go left or right. And if they go up the wrong fallopian tube and there's no egg there, then they eventually will just be destroyed by the female reproductive organs and reabsorbed. Okay, there are about 300 million sperm that are ejaculated during sexual intercourse. Okay, about 200 of those 300 million. Okay, not 200 million, just 200. Okay, 200 cells out of 300 million sperm cells actually get to the vicinity of the egg. Okay, and out of that 200, 99.9% of the times, only one of those sperm actually penetrate the actual egg itself. Okay, sperm move by lashing their flagella or their tail, right? That's what the tail is called, as they crawl along the female mucosa. They may be assisted in some ways by female physiology. Okay, so the cervix has strands of mucus that help guide the sperm through the cervical canal. The uterus itself contracts and sucks the semen from the vagina and spreads it throughout the uterus. So that's going to help the sperm get to where it needs to go. And there are chemical attractant molecules that are released by eggs that attract the sperm from a short distance. So once the sperm actually make it through the uterus, make it through the cervix, and get to into the proper fallopian tube, okay, the egg will release chemical attractant molecules, which will then attract the sperm cells over a short distance. Okay, sperm are viable for up to 6 days after ejaculation. Okay, conception is optimal if sperm are deposited a few days before ovulation. Okay, so if you are trying to get pregnant or have a child, the sperm should be introduced somewhat before ovulation. Okay, for a few days before, okay, maybe 3-4 days before ovulation, and up to 14 hours after ovulation occurs. Okay, when sperm encounters the egg, it undergoes an archosomal reaction, which we'll talk about a little bit more later. Okay, this releases enzymes. Okay, because the archosome is like the head of the sperm cell. Okay, and this archosome is going to release enzymes that help to penetrate the wall of the egg. Okay, and in reality, the egg is much, much, much larger than a sperm cell. Okay, enzymes of many sperm are released to clear a path for the one that will penetrate the egg. So the sperm kind of work together in a way where they're all releasing these enzymes so that it can, weaken the wall of the egg so that one sperm can eventually get into the egg and fertilize it. Okay, there are two enzymes that are released, these two archosomal enzymes, hyaluronidase, which digests hyaluronic acid, that binds the granulosal cells together. So the cells of the egg are held together by this hyaluronic acid. Okay, and these enzymes are going to break that down. Okay, then you have arcosin. Okay, arcosin is a protease similar to trypsin. Okay, it's going to help the sperm get through the egg's walls or cell membranes. Okay, the sperm will release its enzymes and digest the path through the zona until it contacts the egg itself. The sperm's head and midpiece enter the egg. The egg then destroys the sperm's mitochondria, which is important because the female mitochondria, because mitochondria have DNA, okay? And if the sperm's mitochondria weren't destroyed, you would have paternal mitochondrial DNA in the child, but because those mitochondria are destroyed by the egg, okay, you only have maternal. Okay, the egg itself has mitochondria in them for energy, and they have DNA, so the child will always be born with maternal mitochondrial DNA. Okay, so that's what this says, passes only maternal mitochondria on to the offspring. Okay. Fertilization, the act of fertilization combines haploid cells, and we talked about that when we talked a little bit about meiosis. If you want to understand meiosis better, I do have a video on my channel that discusses the difference between meiosis and mitosis. So I suggest you watch that video if you want to understand this a little bit more. We don't really have time to go into it. That's a whole nother lecture on its own. Okay, but a haploid cell is a cell that is a sex cell, right? A haploid is a sex cell, a sperm, an ova, and they have an N number of chromosomes. They only have 23 chromosomes as opposed to 46, which is 2N, right? So when you have a sperm that has 23 chromosomes, which is haploid, and you combine that with a haploid ova, which has 23 chromosomes, they give to you a new cell that is diploid in nature, okay, and has two sets or paired chromosomes. Okay, so fertilization is the combination of haploid and haploid to give you diploid. Okay, and that diploid then becomes a new human being. Okay, polyspermy is the idea of fertilization by two or more sperm, which would produce a doomed fertilized egg. If you have two sperm entering one egg, that egg is not going to be viable. Okay, that egg's not going to go to term at all. How do you get twins? We'll talk about that in a moment. Okay, so pregnancy is divided into 3 month intervals, okay, that we call trimesters. Okay, the first trimester is from fertilization, okay, so from that first conception through 12 weeks. Okay, more than half of all embryos die in the first trimester due to chromosomal defects. And we'll talk about nondisjunction later on, so the last couple of slides of this particular show. Okay, conceptus is this is another term for embryo. So you're going to see this a lot. This is just another term for embryo. Okay, the embryo is most vulnerable to stress, drugs, and nutritional deficiencies during this time. Okay, so this really early part of the first trimester is really crucial in the survivability of the embryo. Okay, if any of these things are happening in high amounts, that could cause the embryo to be aborted by the body. Okay, so the second trimester is week 13 through 24. Okay, organs complete their development here. Okay, the fetus looks distinctively human at this point. Okay, prior to week 13, the embryo looks very similar to other animals that have very similar features. Okay, if you take a look at the embryos of turtles and chickens and humans and pigs and lambs, they all look very, very similar very early on in their development. Okay, but once you go to get to week 13, that's when that embryo, that fetus, begins to look very human-like and stops looking like a lamb and a dolphin and all other types of things that look very similar during very early stages of development. Okay, chance of survival with intensive care, or chance of survival if born near the end of this trimester. So if you give birth to a child in the 24th week or so, there is a slight chance that that child can survive. Okay, the chances aren't great. Okay, but there is a chance. Okay, the third trimester, it begins at week 25 and goes until the baby is born. Okay, the fetus grows very rapidly in this time period. The organs achieve enough cellular differentiation to support life outside the womb. So what that means is if you give birth to a child between these weeks in the third trimester, there's a very good chance that that child can survive. At 35 weeks, and again, don't get me wrong, the closer you get to the end of the third trimester, the better, right? At the 35th week, the baby's around 5.5 pounds on average. The fetus is considered to be mature. Okay, so here's twins that I said we were going to talk about. Okay, so dizotic twins are about 2/3 of all the twins that are born. Okay, two eggs are ovulated and both are fertilized by separate sperm, forming two zygotes. So these are not identical twins. Okay, these are twins that are going to develop just like any other single pregnancy would develop. Okay, but they're just both developing in the womb at the same time. So they're not going to necessarily look identical to one another. Okay, they are no more or less genetically similar than any other siblings. Okay, there are two completely different eggs, and those two eggs have different sets of genes in them from the parent. Okay, and those sperm, okay, are completely different from each other, which have different sets of genes from the other parent. Okay, so they're going to form two individuals that are just as genetically similar as anybody else's brother and sister. Okay, they implant separately in the uterine wall, and each forms its own placenta. Okay, so they each have their own placenta that they can get nutrients from. Okay, monozygotic twins. Okay, that's where one egg is fertilized, but the embryo divides into two up to 14 days after fertilization. Okay, so it's one egg, one sperm, and it divides in two. Okay, that typically doesn't happen. Okay, normally that egg would stay that embryo would stay a single embryo or single zygote and develop on its own. Okay, but for some reason, okay, sometimes it's genetic, sometimes it runs in families, that egg can divide into two, and then they can both develop separately. Okay, but those would be identical twins. Okay, these would be genetically identical twins because you only have one egg and one sperm. Okay, and they would be of the same sex. Okay, they would be of the same sex. Very similar in appearance. That's what you normally think of when you think of twins. Okay, so here is dizygotic twins with separate placentas. Okay, each one of these had its own egg, its own sperm, and they are developing together, but separately. Okay, the pre-embryonic stage, let's talk about that. So the first 16 days of development culminating in the existence of what we call an embryo. Okay, so according to this textbook, okay, the first 16 days of development is called the pre-embryonic stage because this textbook believes that the embryo isn't formed until day 16. So what do you call the first 16 days before the embryo is formed? The pre-embryonic stage. Okay, there are three major processes which we will go through briefly. Okay, you have cleavage, okay, which is the splitting of cells and the dividing of cells, the implantation of the embryo into the uterine wall, and then the embryogenesis, which is the development of the actual embryo itself. Okay, cleavage. These are mitotic cell divisions that occur in the first 3 days while the embryo migrates down into the uterine tube or down out of the uterine tube. Okay, the first cleavage, and cleavage again just means that we are dividing cells, right? We're taking one cell, we are cleaving it in half. Oh, actually, we're taking the internal parts, we're cleaving it in half, so you have cleavage in there, then you cleave those, and what you'll get is something like this, and you'll just get a ball of cells. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and we'll just keep doing that and doing that and doing that until that forms our embryo. Okay, so this first cleavage, okay, forms 30 hours after fertilization. Okay, so it's about a day, a little bit more than a day after fertilization occurs. Okay, the zygote splits into 2 daughter cells, which is what this is, and this is called a blastomere. Each one of these is called a blastomere. Okay, about 72 hours after ovulation, you have what we call the morula stage. Okay, and the morula stage would be if I drew one more up here and I drew 16 circles. 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so this is our blastomere. Okay, and this would be 30 hours after fertilization, and then another cleavage, and then another cleavage, and then another cleavage. Okay, and this would be 72 hours, and this would be called a morula. Okay, it's basically a ball of 16 cells. Okay, after 72 hours. Okay, here you can see a diagram of what I was just doing here. So here is fertilization. Okay, here's my sperm cell. Here's my egg cell. We have fertilization here. Okay, 30 hours after this occurrence. So here is ground zero, I guess, if you want to call it that. Okay, 30 hours after, we see our first cleavage. We see our nucleus dividing into 2, so that this individual is no longer a single-celled organism, is now a multi-celled organism. Okay, and this is the cleavage. Okay, so those 2 cells, they'll split. Each one of those will split, and you'll make 4 cells, and those 4 cells will split and make 8 cells. Okay, and so on and so on, and that'll keep happening. That cleavage will continue to happen and double your amount of cells every time until you get to 72 hours, and what you have is a morula. Okay, and that's what we have here. Okay, and you can see that at different time periods that this fertilized egg is moving down from the fallopian tube. Okay, because here we have the fertilization happening here in the fallopian tube, and then as it travels down the fallopian tube towards the uterus, it is going through cleavage until it eventually gets into the uterus, where we will have the next stage, which is called implantation. Okay, implantation is the process of attachment to the uterine wall. Okay, this begins when the blastocyst adheres to the endometrium. The endometrium is the inner lining of the uterus. Okay, the blastocyst attaches to the wall 6 days after ovulation. Okay, usually on the fundus, which is that top portion of the uterus. Okay, or posterior wall of the uterus, and the active implantation takes about a week. Okay, it's completed about the time the next menstrual cycle, or the next menstrual period, would have started. Right, so that's when a woman misses her period. She might think she's pregnant because that is a sign that a missed menstruation period is a sign that there is a implanted fertilized egg in the uterus. So that's why that is a clear sign of that. So if we go back one picture, okay, so here is the endometrium. Let's see my pen here. Here's the endometrium. Here's that implanted egg. Okay, it could be in the fundus, it could be in the posterior wall. Okay, and that is going to stop menstruation. Okay, that's going to release hormones that are going to stop menstruation. We'll talk about that later. Okay, there's a hormone called human chorionic gonadotropin, okay, HCG, which stimulates the corpus luteum to secrete estrogen and progesterone. Okay, and this is what I was alluding to. Okay, this hormone, HCG, is going to cause the secretion of these hormones, estrogen and progesterone. Okay, progesterone is going to be the hormone that is responsible for the suppression of menstruation. Okay, so we don't, when the body knows that it's pregnant, it doesn't want to menstruate. Okay, it knows that there's a cell that's viable, that's going to attach, or that is attached to the uterus, and it now needs to nourish that cell or that embryo, and it's not going to flush it from the body, right? If that egg did not get fertilized, then the implantation would not have occurred, and then menstruation would have followed. Okay, the levels of HCG rise in the mother's blood until the second month of pregnancy. Okay. At this time, the ovaries become inactive for the remainder of the pregnancy. So that means that the female is not going to continue to release eggs into the fallopian tubes. Okay. And then the estrogen and progesterone levels will rise as this goes on. Okay. The last stage of this pre-embryonic development is called embryogenesis. Okay, this is the arrangement of blastomeres into 3 germ layers. So if we go back, let me go back to this picture. Okay, these cells, okay, these blastomeres, okay, are going to become eventually organ systems, right? And that's what embryogenesis discusses. Okay, these blastomeres, these cleaved cells, are going to start to become differentiated. They're going to become different organ systems. They're going to become different parts of the body, right? So the ectoderm is one of these 3 layers. Okay, so these 3 layers are going to give rise to different organ systems. Okay, so the ectoderm, which is the innermost. Okay, ecto always means inside, endo always means outside, meso always means middle. Okay, so the innermost germ layer. Okay, and this makes sense. The innermost germ layer becomes the nervous system. And where is the nervous system? Where is our brain and our spinal cord? It's directly in the middle of us, right? It's the most internal one. Okay, so the innermost germ layer is going to give rise to the nervous system. It's going to give rise to the brain and spinal cord and the epidermis, okay, which is your skin. Okay, the mesoderm, the middle of you, the middle layer, okay, that's going to become your muscle cells. It's going to become your connective tissue, like your ligaments and your cartilage. Okay, and then your endoderm, that's what's going to become the majority of your internal organs. That's going to be your digestive tract. It's going to be your liver, your pancreas, okay, lungs, things like that. Okay. An ectopic pregnancy is one where the blastocyst is going to not implant in the uterus. It plants somewhere other than the uterus. Okay, this does not happen very often. It's 1 in 300 pregnancies. Okay, one place outside of the uterus that the blastocyst can implant itself is in the uterine tubes or the fallopian tubes, and we call those tubule pregnancies. Okay, so if you have an implantation happening in the uterine tube, that's not a good thing. Okay, this is usually due to some obstruction, such as a constriction resulting from pelvic inflammatory disease, maybe tubular surgeries. Previous ectopic pregnancies could also lead to more ectopic pregnancies, repeated miscarriages. And what happens is that when you have cleavage occurring over and over and over again, and implantation happens in the uterus, that cell is growing and growing and getting larger and larger and larger and larger. And eventually, if it gets too large, okay, it can rupture the actual fallopian tube. Okay, after 12 weeks, that could rupture the actual fallopian tube, and that could cause immense pain and issues for the mom. Okay, you can also have abdominal pregnancies. These are very rare. Okay, abdominal pregnancies is when implantation occurs in the abdominal pelvic cavity. Okay, so it's not even in the reproductive system anymore. Okay, and this is 1 in 7,000 pregnancies, and this can threaten the mother's life. Okay, 9% result in live births, and they must be done by C-section or a cesarean section. Okay, this is a diagram of a birth where the baby is outside of the uterus in the abdominal cavity. Okay, here's the uterus. Okay, this is where the baby should be. Okay, the baby should be developing here. This uterus should be expanding as the baby gets larger and larger and larger, and it pushes up on the digestive organs. Okay, however, the placenta is here at the abdominal wall, okay, instead of the uterine wall. That's where the placenta should be. Okay, and the baby is actually in along with the other digestive organs. Okay, so that is very dangerous for the mom. Okay, and needs to be taken. Obviously, this baby cannot be born the traditional way, right? This baby can't be born through the vaginal canal because it's not even in the right system. It's in the wrong system. Okay, it's in the abdominal wall. It's not even in the reproductive system. So that baby can never come out of the vaginal canal. Okay, this baby must be taken by cesarean section. Okay, so then we have the embryonic stage. We went from the pre-embryonic stage up to the first 16 days where we end up hitting the embryonic stage, which is when all the three primary germ layers are present. All those ectoderm, mesoderm, endoderm are present. The placenta is going to form over the next 6 weeks. Okay, becomes the embryo's primary source of nutrition. That's where that placenta is going to give all the nutrition that the mom puts into her system to the baby. Okay, we have organogenesis. Okay, remember, anytime you see genesis, it's the production of something. So we got the production of organs and organ systems, because these germ layers are going to differentiate into the nervous system, into the cardiovascular system, into the digestive system, and all the other systems. Okay, organs are present at this point, but they're not fully functional yet. Okay, we see them around 8 weeks. We can see hearts, we can see livers, we can see lungs and things like that at 8 weeks, but not all of them are fully functional yet. Okay. The body cavity at this point gets divided into the thoracic and the peritoneal cavities by the diaphragm. Okay, the diaphragm is this muscle that goes underneath the rib cage, and it's going to divide the chest from the gut. Okay, it's from the thoracic cavity and the peritoneal cavity. Okay, sometimes that diaphragm doesn't form fully, and digestive organs can go up into the thoracic cavity and damage lung tissue and cause lungs not to form properly. Okay, but that's a rarity. Okay, by the end of week 5, the thoracic cavity further subdivides into the pleural cavity, which is where the lungs are, and the pericardial cavity is where the heart is going to be located. Okay, so that thoracic cavity is going to further divide into smaller cavities. Okay, we find the appearance of the neural tube. Okay, that'll become the brain and the spinal cord. Okay, we start to see things called somites. Okay, segmentation of the mesoderm into the blocks of tissue that will give rise to the vertebral column. Okay, these somites are blocks of tissue that end up becoming the bones that surround your spinal cord. Okay, these somites also become muscles of the trunk. Okay, they also become part of the dermis of your skin. Okay, and we start to see all this around week 5, week 6 time period. Okay, formation of organs from primary germ layers at 8 weeks. All organs are present. Okay, the ectoderm itself is going to give rise to the epidermis, the nervous system, the lens, the cornea of the eye, and the internal ear. Okay, a lot of senses happening there. Okay, all these things are sense organs. Okay, the mesoderm at week 8 is going to give rise to the skeleton. Okay, the bones, the muscles that attach to that skeleton, the cartilage that protects those bones, your blood, which is made by your bones, your lymphoid tissues. Okay, which are going to be things like your spleen and other things like that. Your gonads, the ovaries and testes, and all the ducts that are associated with them. The kidneys and the ureters. Okay, all of those things come from the endoderm itself. That's where you're going to get your gut, your respiratory epithelium. Okay, which is the inner lining of your lungs, glands, the bladder, and the urethra are all going to come from the endoderm. So make sure you know what comes from the epiderm or the ectoderm, what comes from the mesoderm, and what comes from your endoderm. Okay, here you can see a human developing over various weeks. You can see here is 3 weeks. Oops, let me go back. Okay, here is 3 weeks. Here is 4 weeks. Okay, and at this 4 week and 7 week stage, between 4 and 7, these embryos look very similar to the embryos of other animals. Okay, so if I gave you a human at 7 weeks and I gave you like a lamb at 7 weeks or a lamb at the right week, you would say you might not even be able to distinguish between the two. But once we hit 8 weeks, that's when we see it starts to look like a human, right? 12 weeks, it starts to look like a tiny baby. 20 weeks, that's a person, right? I mean, it's distinguishable. I mean, for me, this is a person as soon as fertilization occurs, but it starts to look like a human baby, in this 8 to 35 week period. Okay. Accessory organs develop the embryo. They include the placenta. Okay, the placenta is an accessory organ that's going to help develop the embryo. The umbilical cord. Okay, and then we have things called embryonic membranes, which are called the amnion, the yolk sac, the allantois, and the chorion. Okay, so we're going to talk about all these individually now. Okay, so the amnion, okay, is the innermost membrane that encloses the embryo. It becomes the amniotic sac. Okay, the only thing that penetrates the amnion is the umbilical cord, and this sac fills up with fluid called amniotic fluid. Okay, what does that fluid do? It helps protect the embryo from trauma. It helps protect the embryo from infection and temperature fluctuations. Okay, so we don't want that embryo going through different temperature ranges. We want it to stay pretty stable, and that fluid will help that. Okay, it also allows freedom of movement, which is very important for muscle development of the fetus. Okay, while it's gestating. Okay, the amnion continued. Okay, it enables the embryo to develop symmetrically. Right, we want the left and right sides of this person to develop the same way. Prevents body parts from adhering to one another. Right, if it's floating around in liquid, that means that the skin and the tissues aren't necessarily touching and getting stuck to one another. We don't want that to happen. Okay, it's going to stimulate lung development because the fetus will breathe in this fluid. Okay. At first, the amniotic fluid is formed from filtration of the mother's blood and the mother's plasma, but eventually the fetus will contribute to the amniotic fluid by urinating into that amniotic cavity, okay, and by producing fluids in the lungs and things like that. Okay, at term, which means at the time of birth, okay, in that 38-week range, okay, you have about 700 to 1,000 milliliters of amniotic fluid. And that amniotic fluid is what is released when the water breaks. Okay, when a woman's water breaks, she is releasing the amniotic fluid out of that amniotic sac, and that's the time where you have to go to the hospital because that baby's going to start coming soon. Okay, the yolk sac is a small sac suspended from the ventral side of the embryo, and it contributes to the formation of the gastrointestinal tract. It's going to help form blood cells. It's going to help form future sperm and egg cells within the testes and the gonads of the baby. Okay, that's the yolk sac. The allantois, it begins as an outpocketing of the yolk sac, so it actually forms from the yolk sac, and that's what's going to give rise to the umbilical cord. Okay, this allantois will become the umbilical cord. It's also going to become part of the urinary bladder of the child. Okay, the chorion is the outermost membrane that encloses all the rest of the membranes of the embryo, and this is going to form the placenta. Okay, the functions of the chorion are to protect and nurture the embryo. There's fluid called chorionic fluid that protects the embryo from shock, and the chorionic villi allow exchange of nutrients, oxygen, and waste products with the mom. Those are all things that the placenta does. All right, so if you understand what the placenta does, you will remember that chorion is the membrane that allows for that stuff to happen. This is a placenta. Okay, this is the top or the superior portion of the placenta. This is the underside, which is going to be what attaches to the wall of the uterus. This is the umbilical cord that connects this placenta to the baby, which should be over here somewhere. Okay, and this is going to connect to the uterus, which and basically is the connection between mother and child. Right, anything that the mom puts into her system will diffuse into this placenta, into all of these arteries and veins, and then into the umbilical vein and umbilical artery of the baby, and be given to them or it. Okay, so prenatal nutrition. Okay, so during gestation, during the development of this baby, the embryo is nourished in 3 different overlapping ways. Okay, there's something called uterine milk. There's trophoblastic nutrition, and there's placental nutrition. Okay, so let's go through those individually. Okay, so uterine milk is glycogen-rich milk, so that's sugar-rich milk. Okay, glycogen is long chains of glucose, which is going to be the primary source for energy for any cell, right? It's glycogen-rich secretion of the uterine tubes and the endometrial glands. So the uterine tubes are going to produce this sugar-rich secretion. The embryo absorbs this fluid as it travels down the tube, okay, and lies free in the uterine cavity before implantation. So this is pre-embryonic time period, right? That's when that uterine milk is going to be used as a nutrient source. Okay, so the trophoblastic nutrition, this is when the embryo consumes decidual cells of the endometrium. Okay, so the endometrium is where that egg implanted itself in the uterus, right? The endometrium of the uterus. Okay, there are cells, decidual cells, that are going to be consumed in the endometrium. Okay, they accumulate and store glycogen, again, another sugar source. They store proteins, they store fats. Okay, so for the first week after implantation, this is going to be the only thing that embryo is going to be able to get its nutrition from, is these decidual cells in the endometrium. Okay, this remains the dominant source through the end of 8 weeks, and you guessed it, that's when the placental nutrition starts, because that's when the placenta is going to form. Right. So before, when it's first fertilized, it's going to rely on that uterine milk. Once implantation occurs, it's going to rely on trophoblastic nutrition of these decidual cells in the uterus wall of the endometrium. And then after that, it's going to rely on the placenta, which is the direct connection to the mom. Okay, the placental nutrition. Nutrients will diffuse from the mother's blood through the placenta into the fetal blood. Okay, the blood itself does not exchange, right? The mother's blood does not enter the fetus's blood does not enter the mother. They might not have the same blood type, so therefore that wouldn't work out if that happened. Okay, it does happen, and it could, it's potentially really dangerous for both the baby and the mom. Okay, the placenta itself is that disc-shaped organ attached to the uterine wall on one side. On the other side, it's attached to the baby through the umbilical cord, which we saw in that other picture. Okay, and this is the sole mode of nutrition from week 12 until birth. There is no other nutrition. There's no more trophoblastic nutrition. There's no more uterine milk at that point. It's strictly placental nutrition from then on out. Okay, here's just a chart that just shows you from week 0, from fertilization to week 8. You're dealing with trophoblastic nutrition. And then from 12 on, it's majority placental nutrition. Okay, the umbilical cord itself contains 2 umbilical arteries and 1 vein. Okay, pumped by the fetal heart, blood flows into the placenta through the umbilical arteries. The bloodstreams of the mom and the baby do not mix. That is very important. We do not want that. However, materials do diffuse across the membrane from an area of higher concentration to an area of lower concentration. Okay, that's what diffuse means. That's what concentration gradient means. Okay, oxygen and nutrients pass into that fetal blood. Fetal waste will pass the other way, okay, and it be eliminated by the mother. So any waste product that the fetus makes, it gives it to the mom so that the mom can release that waste products and through urine and fecal matter. Okay, the placenta is also permeable to things like nicotine that's found in cigarettes, alcohol, other drugs that may be present in the maternal bloodstream. It doesn't always have to be illegal drugs. It could be any type of drug, right? Doctors do not like to give pregnant women drugs of any kind. Okay, they don't like to give them antibiotics. They don't like to give them any drug that would be harmful to the baby during its development. Okay, by the end of 8 weeks, all organs and systems are present. We said that already. The individual is about 3 centimeters long. That is very, very tiny. Okay, now considered to be a fetus. Okay, the bones have begun to calcify at this point. Okay, the skeletal muscles exhibit spontaneous contractions, which at this point are too weak to be felt by the mom. Okay, once the baby starts kicking, that comes a little later on. Okay, the heart, which has been beating since week 4, can now circulate blood at week 8. Okay, the heart and the liver are very large, forming a prominent ventral bulge in the actual fetus. Okay, and the head is nearly half of the total body length of the actual fetus at this point. And it all balances out eventually. Okay, the fetus is the final stage of the prenatal development. From the start of week 9 until birth is when this will happen. Okay, organs will mature to support life outside the mom, right? That's the whole point of this. The organs have to mature. They have to be able to survive outside of the mother. Okay, the fetal circulatory patterns will change at birth when the baby is cut off from the placenta and the lungs expand with air. Okay, that's going to change. It's going to be a big game changer for the baby because the baby is not used to breathing in air. The baby is, kind of used to being almost fish-like, where it's inhaling, liquids. Okay, a full-term fetus averages 14 inches in length. Okay, but I mean, many children are much larger than that. My child was 22 inches long. Okay, average weight about 6.5 to 7.5 pounds. They can be up to 10. I've seen 10-pound babies. Okay, these are all averages. About 50% of the birth weight is added in the last 10 weeks of pregnancy. Okay, so you gain a lot of weight. Pregnant females gain a lot of weight in the last 10 weeks of their pregnancy. Okay, the neonate. Okay, the transitional period from 6. This is the baby that's born, right? Once the baby is born, call it the neonate. Okay, there's a transitional period of the neonate from 6 to 8 hours immediately following birth, where the baby must adapt to life outside of the mom. Okay, the heart rate of this baby and the respiratory rates are going to increase, okay, because they're trying to get oxygen to every cell that they possibly can get to. The body temperature is going to fall, okay, because it's been kept at a constant temperature internally inside the mom. So now the body has to figure out how to keep that temperature up. Okay, physical activity declines in this transitional period, and the baby sleeps for about 3 hours. That is going to be the best 3 hours of sleep that the mom can get and the dad can get right after the baby is born. Okay, then after that, the baby begins a cycle of waking every 3 to 4 hours in order to feed. Okay, and that is the hardest 2 months of your life as a new parent, is dealing with a waking baby every 3 to 4 hours to feed them. Okay, because it makes you very, very tired, but it's all worth it in the end. Okay, the neonatal period will be around the first 6 weeks of life. So it's about 2 months, right? It's 2 months of really torturous kind of sacrifice, but again, it's worth it in the end for your kids. Okay, some respiratory adaptations of the newborn. Okay, the neonate begins to breathe spontaneously. Carbon dioxide begins to accumulate and stimulate respiratory chemoreceptors. That's going to make the baby exhale and inhale, right? That's what's going to cause the baby to exhale and inhale. Your body wants to get rid of that CO2. Okay, and in order to do that, you have to exhale, and then once you exhale, you have to inhale eventually. Okay, it takes great effort to inflate the lungs because they have been collapsed over the past few weeks over development. Okay, and those first few breaths are a little bit of an effort for a newborn. Okay, the first 2 weeks of the baby's life, you'll have 45 breaths per minute, which is a lot. Those are tiny, short little breaths, and there are lots of them. Okay, they eventually, after those 2 weeks, they stabilize. Okay, and you get about 12 breaths per minute after those first 2 weeks, and the baby starts to kind of learn the ropes, right? Learn how to breathe, and the body starts to learn what to do and how to function properly. Okay, some immunologic adaptations of the baby. Cellular immunity appears early in fetal development, but is still very weak. Okay, so the baby has an immune system, but it's very, very limited. Okay, the infant born with near adult levels of IgG, which is a type of immunoglobulin, which is an antibody from the mom, and that is given to the baby through the placenta of the mother. However, after birth, this IgG breaks down very rapidly, so you have to find ways to replenish that. Okay, it does remain high enough for 6 months to protect against things like the measles, diphtheria, polio, and other infectious diseases. Okay, breastfeeding acquires protection from gastroenteritis because when you breastfeed, you are giving the baby IgA, which is another immunoglobulin, which is present in the breast milk. So it's a good thing to breastfeed because you're giving your child immunoglobulins or antibodies. However, many people choose not to breastfeed, and most children that do not breastfeed end up just fine. Okay. Thermoregulation of the baby. The infant has a larger ratio of surface area to volume than an adult does, so therefore the baby loses heat more rapidly than an adult would. Okay. Some things that a baby does to defend against this heat loss is that it has brown fat deposits during 17 to 20 weeks as a fetus, and adults have brown fat as well, and brown fat basically helps to keep you insulated, so that brown fat in the baby is going to help keep the baby insulated. Okay, the mitochondria in the brown fat are going to release all the energy that it can as heat instead of making ATP, which is the chemical energy that cells use. Instead of doing that, it's going to create heat instead. Okay. Brown fat is a heat generating tissue, and it's found in both adults and in babies. Okay, babies grow an increased metabolic rate, and that metabolic rate will then produce heat as the baby grows. Okay, and then it'll eventually gain a subcutaneous fat, which is the fat that bonds your skin to your muscles. And once you accumulate subcutaneous fat, that acts as an insulator, which is going to retain heat. So once you gather some heat, it's going to be harder to lose that heat once you have the subcutaneous fat. Okay, fluid balance in neonates. Okay, since kidneys are not fully developed at birth, neonates have a high rate of water loss and require more fluid intake relative to the body weight. So that's why babies pee so much, right? Babies are constantly urinating because they do not have a high rate of water reabsorption. They have a high rate of water loss. And then what do? You have to keep giving them liquid so that they don't become dehydrated, and then they just keep peeing. Okay. Other systems still require significant maturation, such as the liver, the joints, the nervous system myelation, things like that, over those time periods. If a baby is premature, infants that are born weighing under 5.5 pounds are considered premature. They usually have multiple difficulties in respiration, in thermoregulation, so breathing, keeping heat in, okay, excretion, digestion, liver function. Okay, there's lots of issues that a baby is going to have if it is born prematurely. Okay, infants born before 7 months suffer from infant respiratory distress syndrome, okay, which is going to be issues with their breathing patterns, okay, and the ability of their lungs to inflate. Okay, they're going to have issues with thermoregulation, okay, because their hypothalamus is underdeveloped. Your hypothalamus is what keeps your body temperature constant at 98.6, and if the hypothalamus is not developed properly, that could damage or hinder the thermoregulation of the baby itself. Okay. They can suffer from digestive issues. They can have small stomach volume. They can have underdeveloped sucking and swallowing reflexes, which is going to make feeding a premature baby very difficult and frustrating. Okay, sometimes they have to be fed through tubes. Okay, a nasogastric tube, which is a tube through the nose. Okay, they can tolerate human milk or formula, but they need nutritional supplements if they weigh under 3 pounds. Okay, so the milk or the formula wouldn't be good enough for a premature baby. They'd have to have some other type of nutritional supplement along with it. Okay, premature infants also have immature livers. Their livers have a failure to synthesize proteins that could result in edema. Okay, edema is when we have water buildup in certain areas. They can have deficiencies in clotting. Okay, so their blood might not clot properly. Okay, jaundice. This is very common in neonates. I had jaundice when I was born. I was not premature, but this especially affects premature babies. And what jaundice is like a yellowing of the skin due to the baby not being able to dispose of pigments in bile, which is called bilirubin. Okay, typically in a baby that's not premature, if they have jaundice, they can be put underneath like an incubator lights for a couple of days, and they will go back to normal. Okay, but if the liver is immature, then this might continue. Okay, so now we're going to get into some birth defects, and this is going to basically be the last thing we discuss, but there's plenty of them here to talk about. Okay, so birth defects or congenital abnormalities. This is when you have abnormal structures or positions of organs at birth that result in some type of defect in the development of the baby. Okay, tetralogy is the study of birth defects. Okay, so if you're a tetralogist, you are a scientist that studies birth defects. Not all are noticeable at birth. Okay, not all are some could be genetic. Okay, they're not all physical. Some can be detected months or years later when you figure out that something's not quite right with the development of the baby. And in most cases, the causes of anomalies are unknown. So we do not know why some of these birth defects occur. Okay, tetragens are things that cause anatomical deformities in a fetus, and they can fall into 3 major classes. You can have a drug or a chemical tetragen. You can have a disease that is a tetragen, or you can have things like radiation, such as X-rays and other types of radiation that cause deformities. Okay, exposure to a tetragen in the first 2 weeks of fertilization could cause spontaneous abortions. Okay, which means you can lose the embryo or the fetus. Okay, and the period of greatest vulnerability is weeks 3 through 8 of development. Thalidomide. So let's talk about some of these things. Thalidomide is a drug, okay, that caused birth defects. It was taken off the market in 1961. It was given to mothers for morning sickness or insomnia, trouble sleeping. Little did they know that this was going to cause babies to be born with arms and legs that were formed improperly, often had defects of the ears and the heart and the intestines. So that was a bad choice that doctors just didn't know about at the time. Now we do. Okay, you can have fetal alcohol syndrome, which is another drug-induced defect, which is characterized by baby coming out with a small head or malformed facial features. The cardiac and central nervous systems could be defective. They could have stunted growth. Behavioral signs such as hyperactivity, nervousness, and poor attention span are some of the lesser symptoms of FAS, where malformed features and organs would be a much more prominent issue. Okay, here's a baby that has the effects of thalidomide. Okay, you can see the arm of this child is not formed properly, okay, compared to his size. Okay, cigarette smoking can also lead to birth defects. Okay, contribute to fetal and infant mortality. It could also lead to ectopic pregnancies, which are those pregnancies that are occur in different places other than the uterus. Okay, anencephaly, which is the failure of the brain to develop properly. It could cause cleft palate and cleft lip, or cardiac abnormalities. Cleft palate is when the bone in the back of your mouth does not form, the roof of your mouth rather does not form properly. Okay, and diagnostic X-rays during pregnancy could be tetragenic. Okay, you don't want to give a pregnant woman X-rays. Okay, that could harm the baby. Okay, here is cleft palate. Okay, so this is the roof of the mouth, and you can see that this is a bone that should be fused together, and it's not. Okay, and that I had a friend growing up who had cleft palate, and he had constant surgeries to help fix this problem. Okay. Microorganisms can cross the placenta and cause serious abnormalities such as stillbirth or neonatal death. Okay, some of these microorganisms could be viral infections like herpes, rubella, cytomegalovirus, HIV. You can have bacterial infections like gonorrhea and syphilis. Okay, they can produce blindness. They can produce hydrocephalus, which is water on the brain. It could cause cerebral palsy, seizures, profound physical and mental retardation. Okay, so it's important that you make sure you're keeping yourself safe while being pregnant, or even before that. Always be safe. Okay, some genetic abnormalities. Okay, genetic abnormalities are things that really can't be helped by parents or their behavior. Right, these are not something that you take or that you're bombarded with or that you ingest. These are things that just happen by chance. Okay, and a mutation is a change in a DNA structure. Okay, and mutations can lead to different things called like microcephaly, which is the smallness of the head, stillbirth, childhood cancers. What happens is they have errors in the DNA during the cell cycle, during replication, during the cleavage. Okay, the DNA can form errors in it, and those errors could lead to all different types of genetic disorders. Okay, some genetic disorders result in something called nondisjunction. Nondisjunction is when the gametes are forming. Okay, when those egg and sperm are forming, they form with the wrong amount of chromosomes. Okay, so typically you're supposed to have 23 chromosomes in an egg. Okay, if that egg divides and it has 24 chromosomes by accident, or if it has 22 chromosomes by accident instead of 23, that's going to lead to some type of issue with the baby. And we'll take a look at some of those now. Okay, aneuploidy is the presence of an extra chromosome or the lack of a chromosome. So if you're missing one or have one too many chromosomes, we call that aneuploidy. Okay, most common thing that happens when you have the wrong number of chromosomes is a miscarriage. Okay, if an egg or a fertilized embryo has too many chromosomes or too few chromosomes, a miscarriage could happen. If you have a monosomy, this is when you have one, when you have an egg that has one copy of a chromosome instead of two, right? So this will be when you have too few chromosomes, right? A trisomy is when you have one too many chromosomes. So instead of having two sets, you have three, right? So normally, an egg should have one chromosome 1 through 22 from the 23 from the mom. Okay, if that egg, instead of having 1 through 23, had 1 through 22 and it was missing one, that's a monosomy. Okay, and if it has 24 chromosomes, 1 through 24, that means it has an extra chromosome, which is called a trisomy. Okay, we can find these out. You can actually see if your child has a polyploidy or a monoploidy condition by looking at the amniotic fluid that the baby is sitting in. There are cells of the baby in the amniotic fluid, and you can remove those cells and count the number of chromosomes in those cells to see if your child has the correct amount of chromosomes. Okay, there are different diseases associated with nondisjunction. Nondisjunction, again, is when the eggs or the ova do not have the correct number of chromosomes. One disease is called triple X syndrome. Okay, this is where the egg has two X chromosomes and then gets fertilized by a sperm that has an X chromosome. So you get 2 from the mom, 1 from the dad. That gives you 3 overall. Okay, what that will result in is an infertile female with a mild intellectual impairment. Okay, and you might not know that this person has trisomy X or triple X syndrome until later in life. You also have Klinefelter syndrome. Klinefelter syndrome is when you have an egg that has 2 X's and you have a sperm that has a Y. So mom gave you 2 X's and dad gave you a Y. So you have Klinefelter syndrome. This results in a sterile male with average intelligence and underdeveloped reproductive organs. You have Turner syndrome. Turner syndrome is when the egg does not contain an X chromosome, and the sperm that fertilized that egg has an X chromosome. So you're getting nothing from the mom, but you're getting an X from the dad. Okay, Turner syndrome, 90% die before birth. Okay, survivors show very serious impairment. They can have webbed necks, they can have widely spaced nipples, they can have secondary sexual characteristics fail to develop at puberty, which is like hair, breast tissue, vocal cords, things like that are not going to function or form properly. They're definitely going to be sterile. They're going to be short in stature. Okay, they're going to have lots of physical issues, but 97% die before birth. Okay, we can have things where there are certain chromosomes that if you have too many of, or if you don't have enough of, can even lead to having surviving that issue, right? So if you have too many chromosome number 1s, okay, if you have 3 chromosome number 1s, that's going to end up in a miscarriage. You can't survive with 3 chromosome number 1s. There are only 3 chromosomes that you can survive with too many of them. If you have 3 chromosome 13s, or if you have 3 chromosome 18s or 3 chromosome 21s, you can survive those particular diseases. Okay, so if you have Pateau syndrome, okay, which is trisomy 13, or Edwards syndrome, which is trisomy 18, okay, most of these individuals die before birth. Okay, however, it does go to term, right? If you have trisomies of any of the other numbers, 1, 2, 3, up to 12, 14, 15, 16, there will be a spontaneous abortion prior to birth. Okay, very early on in the pregnancy. Okay, infants born when infants are born with trisomy 18 or 13, they're severely deformed, and fewer than 5% survive a year. Okay, now the one trisomy that people can survive and do survive a lot is trisomy 21, which results in Down syndrome. Okay, it's the most survivable trisomy. Okay, it does have impaired physical development, short stature, flat face with a flat nasal bridge, low set ears. Okay, all of these things are going to be characteristics of someone who has Down syndrome. Okay, They do have outgoing and affectionate personalities. Mental retardation is very common in someone who has Down syndrome. Okay, 1 in 700 or 1 in 800 live births in the United States, so it is fairly, regular. I mean, there are plenty of people that survive with Down syndrome. Okay, 75% die before birth, but 20% of those 20% of those that are born die before the age of 10. Survivors beyond age of 10 have life expectancy of 60 years, so they do have fairly good life expectancies. Okay, the older a female gets, the more chance there is of her child having Down syndrome, and that's because the eggs, the longer the egg sits in the ovary, the higher the risk of nondisjunction occurring and the wrong amount of chromosomes being in that egg. Okay, so a woman under 30 has a chance of 1 in 3,000 of having a child with Down syndrome. Okay, by the age of 35, those odds dip from 1 in 3,000 to 1 in 365. And then by age 48, it's a 1 in 9 chance. So the older a female gets, the higher the chance of having a child with Down syndrome gets. And that is going to do it for this particular chapter. If you have any questions or if you have any comments, please leave them in the comment section below. And if always, you can email me and let me know if you need anything. Have a good one.